Standing beside the overflowing gift table at my reception, I watch my parents approach with those familiar bright smiles that always meant trouble. The fairy lights twinkled overhead as guests danced to the jazz quartet, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. My mother, Patricia, smoothed her navy dress and beamed at me. "Freddie, sweetheart, we're collecting all the gift money tonight. Your sister Brenna desperately needs it for her gambling debts, and family comes first." Before I could even process her words, my new husband, Jake, quietly stepped forward and handed them a thick manila envelope. My parents eagerly tore it open, their triumphant expressions instantly transforming into pure horror as the color drained from their faces. My name is Freddie Carson, and at 28 years old, I thought I finally understood my family's dynamics. As a registered nurse at Philadelphia General Hospital, I'd spent the last 3 years working double shifts, picking up weekend overtime, and living off instant ramen just to save for this wedding. Every detail of today's celebration at Riverside Gardens represented months of careful budgeting and sacrifice. The outdoor ceremony had been perfect despite everything. 150 guests witnessed Jake and me exchange vows under the rose-covered archway I'd dreamed about since childhood. I wore my grandmother's restored lace dress, which I'd spent 6 months having professionally cleaned and altered. The pearl buttons down the back had been hand-sewn by my great-grandmother in 1942, making this gown a precious family heirloom. My parents had arrived 20 minutes late, causing a delay that made our photographer anxious about losing the golden hour lighting. Patricia complained loudly about the seating arrangements, claiming their table was too far from the head table. Robert grumbled about the parking situation and questioned why we'd chosen such an inconvenient location. They'd contributed absolutely nothing to the wedding expenses, but demanded control over the guest list, insisting we invite distant relatives who barely knew Jake and me. My sister Brenna had stumbled in during the processional, clearly intoxicated, before 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Her bridesmaid dress hung wrinkled and stained, and she'd forgotten the bouquet we'd specifically ordered for her. During the ceremony, she made audible comments about being overlooked as maid of honor, despite the fact that her history of reliability issues made that choice impossible. The reception had been magical until this moment. Our traditional money dance raised approximately $4,000 as guests pinned bills to my dress while dancing. Jake spun me around the polished floor while our friends and extended family celebrated with genuine joy. Additional envelopes and checks from generous guests brought our total gift collection to roughly $6,000 money we'd planned to use for our honeymoon to Ireland and as a down payment fund for our first house. I'd been carefully placing each envelope in the designated basket when my parents approached with that calculated look I knew too well. Throughout the evening, they'd been observing the gift collection like hawks watching prey, whispering between themselves and occasionally glancing toward Brenna, who was stumbling around the reception, making inappropriate comments to other guests. Standing there in my grandmother's dress holding Jake's steady hand, I felt the familiar sick feeling in my stomach that accompanied every family gathering. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, but somehow, my parents had found a way to make it about Brenna's problems once again. The envelope Jake handed them contained detailed financial records spanning 2 years. Every bank statement, every receipt, every transaction carefully documented and organized. Inside those papers lay proof that I'd been secretly supporting Brenna financially, while my parents remained completely oblivious to the extent of her manipulation. The records showed over $20,000 in payments I'd made to cover her rehab programs, monthly rent for 3 different apartments, credit card minimum payments, and emergency loans that were never repaid. While my parents assumed I lived comfortably on my nursing salary, the truth was I'd been surviving in a 400-square-foot studio apartment, eating dollar store meals, and walking to work to save bus fare. Every extra penny went toward helping my sister, who called crying about eviction notices and threatened suicide if I didn't immediately transfer money to her account. I'd given up my own therapy sessions, delayed necessary dental work, and worn the same 3 scrubs to work for months because I couldn't afford new ones. My parents stood frozen papers scattered at their feet, finally seeing documented proof of what their golden child had really been doing with my money. Patricia's hands shook as she bent to gather the scattered documents, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. Robert stood motionless, his jaw clenched, as he read transaction after transaction, showing my financial sacrifices. The jazz quartet continued playing in the background, but guests at nearby tables had begun to notice the commotion and were straining to hear our conversation. "What is this supposed to mean?" Patricia demanded, waving a bank statement in the air. "Why do we have records of your personal finances at your wedding reception?" The familiar defensive tone in her voice made my chest tighten. Even faced with undeniable evidence, she was already preparing to dismiss or rationalize what she was seeing. Robert remained silent, studying a receipt for 3 months of rent I'd paid for Brenna's apartment near the university. "It means," I said, slowly finding my voice despite the trembling in my hands, "that I've been supporting Brenna financially for 2 years while you both believed her stories about getting her life together. Every time she called crying about needing help, I transferred money from my savings account because I couldn't bear to see our family fall apart." Brenna chose that moment to stumble over from the bar, clutching a half-empty glass of wine. Her mascara had smudged under her eyes, and the flower crown she'd insisted on wearing sat crooked on her uncombed hair. "What's everybody looking so serious about?" She slurred, then noticed the papers in our parents' hands. Her face immediately paled beneath her foundation. "These are Freddie's bank records," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge I'd rarely heard before. "They show she's been paying your rent and expenses while telling us you were handling everything independently." Jake stepped closer to me, his presence providing the strength I needed to continue. As a financial advisor, he'd witnessed countless family meetings where money revealed ugly truths about relationships. He'd insisted we document everything before this confrontation, knowing my parents would demand proof of their enabling behavior. Brenna promised she was attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings. I explained, my voice growing stronger with each word. She said the money was temporary help while she got back on her feet. She cried on the phone about losing apartments and not being able to afford food. I couldn't just let my sister become homeless. The weight of suppressed resentment finally broke through my usual people-pleasing facade. Years of watching my parents celebrate Brenna's temporary improvements while completely ignoring my steady achievements came flooding out in a rush of emotion. "Do you know what I've sacrificed for her?" I continued facing my parents directly. I missed meals because I couldn't afford groceries after sending her emergency money. I worked overtime shifts until I collapsed from exhaustion because she needed help with utility bills. I delayed getting my wisdom teeth removed for 8 months because she needed rehab money that she apparently never used for actual treatment. Patricia's eyes filled with tears, but she still couldn't accept the reality in front of her. "Freddie, honey, you should have told us if Brenna was struggling this badly. We could have worked together as a family to help her." "Like you're trying to work together now by stealing my wedding gifts," Jake interjected, his usually calm demeanor showing cracks of controlled anger. "I've watched Freddie stress herself sick for months trying to support someone who lies to your faces constantly. She deserves better than being treated like a family ATM machine." The accusation hit Robert like a physical blow. His face flushed red as he processed the implications of what they'd attempted to do. "We weren't stealing anything," he protested weakly. "We were trying to help our daughter who's in serious trouble." "Which daughter?" I asked pointedly. "Because I'm also your daughter and I've been in serious financial trouble for 2 years trying to save Brenna from consequences she created herself. When was the last time either of you asked how I was doing or whether I needed anything?" The question hung in the air as my parents realized they couldn't remember a single instance of checking on my well-being. Their entire focus had been on managing Brenna's latest crisis while assuming I was strong enough to handle everything alone. Brenna's wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the venue's stone patio. This is all getting blown way out of proportion, she said desperately, her words slurring together. Yeah, Freddie helped me out sometimes, but it's not like she was my only income source. I had other money coming in. From where, Jake demanded his financial advisor instincts recognizing obvious deception. Because these records show you haven't held a steady job in 18 months and your unemployment benefits ended 6 months ago. Caught in her lie, Brenna's facade crumbled. Her voice became shrill and defensive. Fine. Maybe I borrowed more than I should have, but family is supposed to help each other. Freddie makes good money as a nurse. She could afford to help me get back on my feet. The casual dismissal of my financial struggles sent rage coursing through my veins. I could afford it, I repeated incredulously. Brenna, I was living off peanut butter sandwiches and working 16-hour shifts to keep up with your demands for money. I haven't bought new clothes in over a year because every spare dollar went to keeping you housed and fed. Patricia finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. We had no idea it was this extensive, Freddie. You never said anything about struggling financially. Because every time I tried to suggest Brenna needed professional help instead of money, you both accused me of being unsupportive and selfish. I replied, my voice cracking with emotion. You made it clear that questioning Brenna's stories meant betraying the family. The confrontation had drawn the attention of several wedding guests who were pretending to admire the garden landscaping, while obviously listening to our argument. Jake's parents approached discreetly, offering to help mediate or provide privacy, but I shook my head. This conversation had been years in the making. Brenna swayed on her feet, her defensive anger shifting to something more desperate. Look, maybe I wasn't completely honest about everything, but I really do need that money tonight. There are people I owe, and if I don't pay them back soon, bad things are going to happen. What kind of people? Robert asked sharply, his parental protective instincts finally engaging. Just some guys I borrowed money from for gambling, Brenna mumbled, avoiding eye contact. They're not very patient about getting paid back, and they know where our whole family lives. The implication sent a chill through the group. Patricia grabbed Robert's arm, suddenly understanding that this situation might be more dangerous than simple financial irresponsibility. The wine and adrenaline had loosened Brenna's tongue enough to reveal information she'd obviously intended to keep hidden. You borrowed money from loan sharks. Jake asked, his professional experience recognizing the warning signs immediately. How much money are we talking about, and how long ago? Brenna's eyes darted between our parents' horrified faces and my growing realization that she'd escalated far beyond gambling addiction into truly dangerous territory. $15,000, she whispered. I borrowed it 3 months ago when I thought I had a sure thing at the casino. I was going to win everything back and pay off all my debts at once. The number hit like a physical blow. Robert staggered backward, his face going gray, as he calculated the implications. Patricia made a small whimpering sound, her hands flying to cover her mouth in horror. But Jake's expression remained skeptical. That's convenient timing, he said coolly, threatening family safety right when Freddie's wedding gifts provide an easy solution. This sounds like manipulation to avoid consequences for lying about how you spent the money she already gave you. Brenna's desperate mask slipped for just a moment, revealing calculation underneath the apparent panic. She'd played this scene before escalating crisis to force family compliance with her demands. But this time, she'd underestimated Jake's ability to recognize emotional blackmail. You want to know the real truth about where your precious support money went? Brenna snarled, her desperate act crumbling completely. I never spent it on rehab or rent like I told you. I used every penny Freddie sent me to fund my real addiction. Online poker, casino trips to Atlantic City sports betting apps. I lost it all and kept going back for more because I knew my bleeding heart sister would always bail me out. The confession hit me like a slap across the face. 2 years of my life, $20,000 of my savings, countless sleepless nights worrying about her well-being, all based on elaborate lies designed to fund her gambling habit, while she lived rent-free in apartments I was unknowingly paying for. The revelation about the loan sharks hung heavy in the humid evening air, but Jake's skeptical expression hadn't wavered. As a financial advisor, he'd seen enough family manipulation tactics to recognize when someone was escalating drama to avoid accountability. His calm analysis cut through Brenna's panic like a blade. "Let me understand this correctly," Jake said evenly, his professional training taking over. "You borrowed $15,000 from dangerous criminals 3 months ago, but you're just mentioning this life-threatening situation now at Freddie's wedding when there happens to be thousands of dollars in easily accessible cash available." Brenna's eyes darted nervously as she realized her story was falling apart under scrutiny. "I thought I could handle it myself," she stammered. "I've been trying to win the money back, but nothing's worked out. These guys don't care about excuses or family celebrations. They want their money tonight." "What's the name of this lending organization?" Jake pressed, pulling out his phone. Because legitimate businesses, even predatory ones, don't typically demand payment during evening hours or threaten family members without extensive documentation of the debt. Patricia clutched Robert's arm tighter, her maternal instincts warring with growing suspicion about her daughter's truthfulness. "Brenna, sweetheart, you need to be completely honest with us right now. If you're really in physical danger, we'll figure out how to help you safely. But if you're lying to manipulate us into covering more gambling losses," Robert added grimly, "this conversation ends immediately." The pressure of sustained questioning was clearly affecting Brenna's ability to maintain her deception. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool evening breeze, and her hands shook as she set down her empty wine glass on a nearby table. "Fine," she snapped, her voice taking on a vicious edge. "Maybe the loan shark thing was an exaggeration, but I really do owe money to people who aren't going to just forget about it. And since everyone's being so honest tonight, let me share some truth about your perfect little princess here." She pointed an unsteady finger at me, her face contorting with years of suppressed resentment. "Saint Freddie has been tracking every penny I spend like some kind of financial stalker. She acts so generous and supportive, but she's been building a case against me this whole time, documenting everything, so she could humiliate me publicly when it suited her purposes." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Jake had encouraged me to keep records after the first few $1,000s disappeared without explanation, but my motivation had been protecting myself, not gathering evidence to destroy my sister. "I documented the transactions because you kept asking for more money without explaining where the previous amounts had gone," I replied quietly. "Every time I asked about your progress or suggested we create a budget together, you accused me of not trusting you and threatened to cut contact with the family." Jake stepped forward slightly, his protective instincts engaging as he watched Brenna's desperate attempts to shift blame. "The documentation was my idea," he said firmly. "Not because we wanted to embarrass you, but because Freddie was sacrificing her health and financial security for someone who clearly wasn't being honest about needing help." "Oh, how convenient that her new husband is already turning her against her family," Brenna shot back. "You've been poisoning her mind against us from the beginning, haven't you? Making her think she's some kind of victim instead of recognizing her responsibility to help family members who are struggling." The manipulation tactic was textbook emotional abuse, and Jake recognized it immediately. "Freddie made every decision about supporting you independently," he replied calmly. "I actually encouraged her to set boundaries months ago, but she insisted on continuing to help because she loves you and wanted to believe you were genuinely trying to recover. That's rich coming from someone who's known our family for less than 2 years. Robert interjected, his protective instincts finally kicking in despite everything. "You don't understand the complexity of family relationships or the history we're dealing with here." The comment revealed how deeply my parents' enabling had become ingrained in their worldview. Even faced with evidence of Brenna's deception and manipulation, they were more comfortable attacking Jake than confronting their role in creating this situation. "You're right that I haven't known your family very long," Jake replied steadily. But I've seen enough to recognize that Freddie has been exploited for years while you've enabled destructive behavior instead of encouraging genuine recovery. Nobody asked for your analysis of our family dynamics, Patricia said sharply, her defensive walls rebuilding as the conversation threatened their carefully constructed narrative about being supportive parents. But Brenna wasn't finished with her revelations. The combination of alcohol and desperation had loosened her tongue beyond her ability to control, and she was determined to inflict maximum damage before facing consequences for her lies. "You want to know what else your precious daughter has been hiding?" She slurred, swaying slightly as she prepared to drop another bombshell. "The money wasn't even the worst thing I needed help with. 6 months ago, when I was really desperate for cash, I took some things from the family safe to sell, just temporarily until I could win enough to buy them back." My blood turned to ice as the implication hit me. "What things?" I whispered, already knowing the answer would destroy something irreplaceable. "Just some old jewelry that nobody was using anyway," Brenna said dismissively, completely missing the horror spreading across my face. "Grandmother's ring collection, those vintage bracelets from the 1800s, a couple of necklaces. I got decent money for them at a pawn shop downtown." The admission hit like a physical blow to my chest. Grandmother's jewelry collection wasn't just valuable, it represented 4 generations of family history. Each piece had a story, a connection to women who had worn them during significant moments in their lives. The engagement ring alone had been in our family since 1892. "You stole and sold great-grandmother's jewelry." I gasped, my voice barely audible above the sound of my heart breaking. "Brenna, those pieces were supposed to be passed down to my future daughters. They were family heirlooms, not commodities to be sold for gambling money." Patricia's legs gave out, and she sank into a nearby chair as the magnitude of what had been lost became clear. Those jewelry pieces had been her inheritance from her own grandmother, treasures she'd carefully preserved to pass down to her daughters and granddaughters. "I was planning to buy them back," Brenna said weakly, her bravado crumbling as she realized she'd confessed to something far worse than lying about money. "I just needed quick cash, and I knew where the safe combination was. I thought I'd win big and get everything back before anyone noticed." "How long have they been gone?" Robert asked quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous calm that indicated barely controlled rage. "Since February," Brenna mumbled, unable to meet anyone's eyes. 6 months. The jewelry had been gone for 6 months, sold for a fraction of their sentimental and monetary value, while I'd been eating ramen noodles and working double shifts to support the person who'd stolen irreplaceable pieces of our family legacy. Jake immediately pulled out his phone and began researching local pawn shops, his efficient problem-solving nature kicking in even amid the emotional chaos. "Which pawn shop?" he demanded, "because there might still be time to recover some pieces if we move quickly." "I don't remember exactly," Brenna lied, clearly hoping to avoid providing information that would reveal the extent of her theft. "It was somewhere downtown. There are lots of those places." "The police can help us track down where family heirlooms were sold," Jake said grimly, his patience with her evasiveness finally exhausted. "Pawn shops are required to keep detailed records of transactions and hold items for specific periods before reselling them." The mention of police involvement sent panic across Brenna's face. "You can't involve the police in family business," she pleaded. "This is between us. We can work something out without getting authorities involved." "You stole and sold family heirlooms to fund gambling," I said slowly, my voice growing stronger as rage replaced shock. "This stopped being a family matter when you decided my inheritance was your emergency fund." Wedding guests had begun moving closer to our secluded area, drawn by the raised voices and obvious distress. Jake's parents approached discreetly, offering to help manage the situation or provide privacy for our family discussion. "Maybe we should move this conversation to a more private location." Jake suggested, noticing the growing audience of concerned relatives and friends. But before anyone could respond, hotel security approached our group with grim expressions and a police officer in tow. Behind them walked Mrs. Henderson, the mother of Jake's college roommate, clutching her purse with shaking hands. "Excuse me, folks," the security supervisor said politely but firmly. "We need to speak with someone about a theft that occurred in our coat check area about 30 minutes ago." All eyes turned to Brenna, whose face had gone completely white as the officer stepped forward with handcuffs already prepared. The police officer's badge gleamed under the reception's string lights as he approached our group with practiced authority. Mrs. Henderson stood beside him, clearly shaken but determined to see justice done. Her gray hair was disheveled, and she kept clutching her recovered purse as if it might disappear again. "Ma'am," the officer addressed Brenna directly, "we have security camera footage showing you removing cash and gift cards from multiple purses in the coat check area approximately 30 minutes ago. Hotel staff witnessed you attempting to conceal the items in your dress when Mrs. Henderson caught you in the act." Brenna's face cycled through several emotions as she processed being caught red-handed in yet another theft. First came denial, her mouth opening to protest innocence, then calculation as she searched for an excuse, and finally resignation as she realized the evidence was overwhelming. "This is ridiculous," she stammered weakly. "I was just looking for my own purse. There must be some kind of misunderstanding." "The cameras show you systematically going through 6 different purses," the officer replied calmly, consulting his notes. "You removed cash totaling $237 and 4 gift cards before Mrs. Henderson noticed her wallet was missing and alerted hotel security." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her voice shaking with indignation. "I watched her stuff my grocery store gift cards into her bra," she said firmly. "When I confronted her, she tried to claim she'd found them on the floor and was looking for their owner. But the cameras don't lie." The weight of this newest revelation crashed over our family like a tidal wave. Patricia covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she processed that her daughter had been stealing from wedding guests while we argued about her gambling debts. Robert stood frozen, his face gray with shock and humiliation. "Officer, I need to share something important." Jake said, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding us. "We've just discovered that she's also stolen family heirlooms and has a history of financial deception spanning several years." The officer's expression grew more serious as he recognized this wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment, but part of a pattern of criminal behavior. "Has this person been arrested before for theft or fraud?" "Actually, yes," he replied after checking his computer database. "Miss Brenna Carson has outstanding warrants in Delaware and New Jersey for check fraud and identity theft. She's been avoiding court dates for 6 months." The information hit our family like a series of explosions. None of us had known about previous arrests or legal troubles in other states. Brenna had somehow concealed an entire criminal history while manipulating us into believing she was simply struggling with gambling addiction. "Outstanding warrants," Patricia whispered, her voice barely audible. "Brenna, what have you been doing?" "It's not as bad as it sounds," Brenna said desperately, her lies becoming more frantic as her world collapsed around her. "Those charges are just misunderstandings. I had permission to use those credit cards, and the checks were signed by people who owed me money." But the officer was already reaching for his handcuffs. "Ma'am, you're being arrested for theft and will be held pending investigation of the outstanding warrants. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked into place, the full scope of Brenna's deception became clear. She hadn't been struggling with gambling addiction. She'd been conducting a sophisticated campaign of fraud and theft across multiple states, while using our family's sympathy and financial support as cover for her criminal activities. "We need to contact our attorney immediately," Robert said quietly, his voice hollow with shock. "This is going to require legal representation." Jake's background check company connections came in handy as he began making calls to investigate the full extent of Brenna's criminal record. Within an hour, we had a clearer picture of what our family had unknowingly been supporting. The Delaware charges stemmed from Brenna writing fraudulent checks using accounts she'd opened with stolen identities. She'd created fake identification documents and used them to establish banking relationships, then wrote checks against empty accounts to fund gambling trips to Atlantic City casinos. The New Jersey charges were even more serious. She'd been caught using stolen credit card information to purchase casino chips, then attempting to cash out winnings as legitimate gambling proceeds. The scheme had involved multiple victims whose financial information she'd gathered through various social engineering techniques. The total damages across all her known crimes exceed $50,000. Jake's contact reported grimly. And these are just the cases where victims have pressed charges. There may be additional unreported incidents. Patricia began sobbing as the magnitude of her daughter's criminal behavior became clear. "How did we miss all of this?" she cried. "How could we not know our own child was stealing from strangers and ruining people's lives?" "Because she's a sophisticated manipulator," Jake replied gently but firmly. "She used your love and concern to create cover for increasingly serious crimes. The gambling addiction story provided perfect justification for always needing money and explaining away suspicious behavior. As police took Brenna away in handcuffs, she made one final attempt to manipulate the situation. "Freddie, you can't let them do this to me," she pleaded. "I'm your sister. Family sticks together no matter what. You know I'll pay back every penny once I get out of this mess." The familiar guilt-inducing phrase that had worked so effectively for years fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. I looked at her clearly for perhaps the first time, seeing not the troubled sister I'd been trying to save, but a calculating criminal who'd exploited my love and generosity to fund increasingly dangerous illegal activities. "No, Brenna," I said quietly, my voice carrying new strength and clarity. "Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't lie and manipulate for years while pretending to need help. Family doesn't put innocent people in danger to avoid consequences for their choices." The conversation with our family attorney later that evening revealed even more disturbing information. Professional forensic accounting showed that Brenna had been systematically embezzling from our parents' small business for 3 years, forging their signatures on checks and using their business credit cards for personal expenses. "The total theft from your parents' accounts exceeds $40,000. The attorney explained grimly. "She's been very careful to keep individual transactions small enough to avoid immediate detection. But the cumulative damage has put your business in serious financial jeopardy." Robert's landscaping company, which he'd built over 25 years of hard work, was facing bankruptcy because his trusted daughter had been slowly draining the accounts while presenting herself as a helpful family member managing administrative tasks. "She had access to everything," Patricia said numbly. "We gave her signature authority on the business accounts when she offered to help with bookkeeping. We thought she was trying to contribute something positive to the family." The cruel irony wasn't lost on any of us. While I'd been sacrificing my financial security to support someone I believed was struggling, that same person had been systematically destroying our parents' life savings and business reputation. But the devastating discoveries weren't finished yet. The attorney's investigation uncovered that Brenna had also been stealing from elderly neighbors, using her charm and family connections to gain access to their homes and financial information. Mrs. Rodriguez next door hired Brenna to help with grocery shopping and bill paying, the attorney reported. Over 6 months, Brenna stole approximately $8,000 by writing checks to herself and using Mrs. Rodriguez's debit card for cash advances. She volunteered to help with elderly outreach at our church. Patricia whispered the full scope of betrayal becoming clear. We were so proud that she was finally doing something positive with her life. Instead, Brenna had used church connections to identify vulnerable elderly targets, then systematically exploited their trust and physical limitations to steal money for gambling. The sophisticated nature of her crimes showed careful planning and a complete lack of remorse for the harm caused to innocent victims. Jake's financial expertise helped us understand that recovering from Brenna's theft would require years of legal proceedings and might never fully compensate victims for their losses. Many of the stolen funds had been immediately gambled away, leaving no recoverable assets to satisfy court judgments. "The house will have to be sold to pay restitution to victims," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of losing everything he'd worked to build. 25 years of building a business and saving for retirement, gone because we trusted our daughter to help manage our finances. The revelation about forged retirement fund withdrawals was perhaps the most devastating blow. Brenna had systematically drained their pension accounts over 18 months, forging signatures and using their personal information to authorize early withdrawals that carried massive tax penalties. "She stole our ability to retire," Patricia said numbly. "We'll be working until we die because our daughter decided our life savings belonged to her." The emotional toll of these discoveries was overwhelming, but they also provided clarity about the choice I faced. I could continue enabling this destructive pattern by helping my parents cover restitution payments, or I could finally establish boundaries that protected myself and any future family Jake and I might create. Standing in our hotel suite after the longest day of our lives, Jake held me as I processed the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about my family relationships. The sister I'd sacrificed for was a criminal who'd never felt genuine affection for me. The parents who'd raised me to prioritize family loyalty above all else had been so focused on managing crisis that they'd never noticed my own needs or struggles. "The hardest part," I told Jake quietly, "is realizing that all my sacrifice and stress never actually helped anyone. I was just funding criminal activities while enabling my parents to avoid confronting the truth about what Brenna had become. Tomorrow would bring court appearances, victim impact statements, and the beginning of legal proceedings that would dominate our lives for months. But tonight, surrounded by the wreckage of illusions about family loyalty and unconditional love, I finally understood that protecting myself wasn't selfish, but necessary for building the healthy relationships I deserved." The next morning brought a parade of phone calls from victims' attorneys and law enforcement agencies across 3 states. Jake and I sat in our hotel room still in our wedding clothes from the night before, trying to process the scope of destruction Brenna had left in her wake. My beautiful reception dress hung wrinkled and stained, a fitting metaphor for how my family celebrations had been permanently tainted. Detective Morrison from the Philadelphia Police Department arrived at 10:30 with a thick file containing evidence of Brenna's local crimes. A seasoned officer with 20 years of experience investigating financial fraud, she'd seen enough family destruction to understand the emotional toll on relatives of career criminals. "Your sister has been operating sophisticated schemes for at least 4 years." Detective Morrison explained, spreading photographs and documents across the hotel room desk. "She's not a gambling addict who made poor decisions. She's a career criminal who used gambling as cover for systematic fraud and theft." The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Bank records showed Brenna had opened accounts using stolen identities in 5 different cities. Credit card companies had flagged her for fraudulent transactions totaling over $70,000. Even her supposed gambling losses were fabricated. Most of the money had been transferred to offshore accounts that investigators were still trying to trace. "The elderly neighbor exploitation is particularly disturbing," Detective Morrison continued. "She specifically targeted seniors with cognitive decline, knowing they'd be less likely to notice missing money or remember giving her permission to access their accounts." Mrs. Rodriguez was 83 years old and showed early signs of dementia. Brenna had befriended her over several months, gradually gaining access to her banking information and checkbook. The theft had gone undetected until Mrs. Rodriguez's nephew noticed unusual expenses during a routine review of her finances. "There are at least 6 other elderly victims in the surrounding neighborhoods," the detective explained grimly. She used church directories and community volunteer lists to identify targets, then presented herself as a helpful young woman, offering assistance with errands and household tasks. The systematic nature of the elder abuse showed a level of calculation that made my skin crawl. This wasn't impulsive behavior driven by addiction, it was predatory targeting of vulnerable community members who'd trusted her because of family connections and religious affiliations. Jake's financial background helped him understand the broader implications of Brenna's crimes. "The identity theft charges carry federal penalties," he said quietly. "If she's convicted on all counts, she's looking at significant prison time. Minimum 4 years, potentially up to 12, depending on victim impact and criminal history," Detective Morrison confirmed. "The judge will consider the sophisticated nature of the schemes and the vulnerability of many victims when determining sentencing." My parents arrived at noon looking like they'd aged 10 years overnight. Patricia's usually perfect makeup was smeared from crying, and Robert's hands shook as he accepted coffee from the hotel's room service. They'd spent the morning meeting with bankruptcy attorneys and trying to calculate the full extent of their financial ruin. "The business is finished," Robert said hollowly. 25 years of building client relationships and reputation destroyed because customers don't trust a company whose owner can't control his own daughter. Half our contracts have been canceled already. The landscaping business employed 12 people who'd now lost their jobs because of Brenna's crimes. Families who depended on steady income were suddenly unemployed because their employer's daughter had stolen money and destroyed the company's credibility with customers and suppliers. "We owe over $60,000 to suppliers and subcontractors," Patricia added, her voice barely above a whisper. "Money that Brenna stole from our business accounts was supposed to pay for materials and labor. Now we're facing lawsuits from vendors who delivered services we can't pay for." The human cost of Brenna's choices extended far beyond our immediate family. Innocent employees, suppliers, and vendors were suffering financial hardship because they'd trusted a business that employed a thief. The ripple effects would impact dozens of families who'd done nothing wrong except trust the wrong people. Jake's contact at the forensic accounting firm provided additional devastating news. "She's been running similar schemes in Delaware and New Jersey for over 2 years, he reported. "Local authorities estimate total damages across all jurisdictions exceed $200,000. $200,000. The number was so large it felt abstract, but each dollar represented real harm to real people who'd trusted someone they believed was helping them. Elderly victims had lost life savings. Small business owners faced bankruptcy. Families struggled to recover from identity theft that would impact their credit and financial stability for years. The most disturbing part," the accountant continued, "is that she's been documenting her crimes in detail. We found spreadsheets tracking victim information, including notes about which targets were most vulnerable and how much money could be extracted before they noticed. The premeditation revealed by those records shattered any remaining illusions about addiction or mental health issues driving Brenna's behavior. She'd been conducting careful research on victims, planning elaborate deceptions, and tracking her criminal profits like any other business venture." Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychologist consulted by the prosecution, helped explain the personality profile behind such systematic exploitation. "Individuals who target elderly victims specifically often display antisocial personality traits with no capacity for genuine empathy," she explained during our consultation. "The family manipulation you experienced was likely just another tool in her arsenal for exploiting people who cared about her. Understanding that my love and concern had been weaponized against me was perhaps the most painful revelation of all. Every tearful phone call about needing help, every promise to get better, every expression of gratitude for my support had been calculated manipulation designed to maintain access to money I couldn't afford to lose. She's a master manipulator who used your family bonds to create the perfect cover for criminal activities," Dr. Chen continued. "The gambling addiction story provided justification for always needing money while explaining away any suspicious behavior patterns. Our family attorney recommended we pursue civil litigation to recover damages, but the reality was that Brenna had no recoverable assets. Most stolen money had been immediately spent on gambling or transferred to accounts that investigators couldn't locate. Even successful lawsuits would likely result in uncollectible judgments against someone facing years in prison. The best outcome would be restitution orders as part of her criminal sentencing. The attorney explained, but those payments would be made slowly over many years and might never fully compensate victims for their losses. My parents faced the impossible choice between helping victims recover their losses or protecting their own financial survival. Their house represented their only significant asset, and selling it would provide funds for partial restitution, but leave them homeless and unable to afford rent on their reduced retirement income. "We're 62 and 64 years old," Patricia said tearfully. "We should be planning retirement cruises and visiting grandchildren. Instead, we're starting over with nothing because we raised a daughter who became a criminal." The emotional devastation was compounded by social consequences that extended throughout our community. Church members, neighbors, and business associates had all been impacted by Brenna's crimes. Everywhere my parents went, they faced questions, accusations, and judgment from people who couldn't understand how they'd failed to recognize their daughter's criminal behavior. "I can't go grocery shopping without someone asking why we didn't stop her from stealing from Mrs. Rodriguez," Patricia sobbed. "They look at us like we're somehow responsible for not knowing our daughter was a career criminal." Jake and I realized that supporting my parents through this crisis would require years of financial assistance that could destroy our own future stability. The house down payment fund we'd been building our retirement savings, even our ability to start a family would be compromised if we took responsibility for repairing damage caused by Brenna's crimes. "We have to make a choice," Jake said gently but firmly. "We can destroy our future trying to fix problems we didn't create, or we can establish boundaries that protect our ability to build a healthy life together." The conversation about boundaries felt like betraying everything I'd been taught about family loyalty, but Detective Morrison's final revelation made the decision unavoidable. "The offshore account investigation revealed that your sister has been planning to flee the country if her crimes were discovered," she reported. "She had false identification documents and plane tickets to a non-extradition country ready to use if law enforcement got too close. Even facing overwhelming evidence of her crimes, Brenna had no intention of accepting responsibility or making amends to her victims. She'd been prepared to abandon our family completely rather than face consequences for the destruction she'd caused." Standing in that hotel room surrounded by evidence of systematic betrayal and calculation, I finally understood that my sister was not the struggling addict I'd been trying to save. She was a predator who'd used my love against me while destroying innocent people's lives for personal profit. The realization was devastating, but also liberating. For the first time in years, I could see clearly that protecting myself and my marriage wasn't selfish, but necessary for creating the life I deserved. My family's crisis was not my responsibility to fix, especially when fixing it would require sacrificing everything Jake and I had worked to build together. The decision to fight back instead of continuing to enable destruction came during a sleepless night in our hotel room. Jake held me as I grieved not just for the money I'd lost, but for the sister I'd never actually had, and the parents who'd chosen crisis management over protecting their honest daughter. By dawn, my tears had transformed into determination to reclaim control over my life. "I'm testifying against her in all the criminal proceedings," I announced to my parents over breakfast in the hotel restaurant. Every lie, every manipulation, every dollar she stole from me while I ate ramen noodles and worked overtime to support her criminal activities. Patricia's coffee cup clattered against the saucer as she processed my words. "Freddie Honey testifying against your own sister will destroy any chance of family reconciliation when she gets out of prison. Don't you think we should focus on healing rather than revenge?" The familiar pattern of prioritizing Brenna's feelings over my well-being triggered a surge of anger that had been building for years. "Family reconciliation," I repeated incredulously. "Patricia, She stole our grandmother's jewelry to fund gambling trips. She forged your signatures to drain your retirement accounts. She exploited elderly neighbors who trusted her because of their connection to our church. What exactly are we supposed to reconcile with? Robert tried a different approach, appealing to my sense of family loyalty that had been so effectively exploited in the past. She's sick, Freddie. Addiction is a disease, and prison won't cure her. Maybe if we stand together as a family, we can help her get the treatment she really needs. She's not sick, Jake interjected firmly, having researched extensively with forensic psychology experts. She's a career criminal who used addiction as a cover story for systematic fraud. The evidence shows years of premeditation and careful planning. That's not addiction. That's antisocial personality disorder. Dr. Chen had explained that true remorse requires empathy for victims and genuine desire to make amends. Brenna had shown neither quality, instead focusing on avoiding consequences and maintaining her victim narrative even when faced with overwhelming evidence of her crimes. I hired attorney Margaret Walsh, a specialist in family financial abuse cases, to help me navigate the complex process of recovering stolen assets and pursuing civil litigation. Her first priority was documenting every transaction, every lie, every instance of manipulation that had cost me money I couldn't afford to lose. Your case is particularly strong because you have detailed financial records spanning 2 years, Attorney Walsh explained. Most family financial abuse victims don't maintain such comprehensive documentation of the exploitation. Jake's insistence on keeping records had seemed paranoid at the time, but now those documents provided the foundation for legal action that could result in meaningful restitution. Every bank statement, every text message asking for money, every lie about rehab programs or emergency expenses had been carefully preserved. The civil lawsuit sought damages not just for the money stolen directly, but for the broader financial harm caused by her deception. Opportunity costs from delayed home ownership career advancement postponed due to financial stress, and medical care deferred because money went to supporting criminal activities instead of maintaining my own health and stability. We're seeking damages of $50,000 representing direct theft interest on stolen funds and compensatory damages for the financial setback you've suffered, Attorney Walsh explained. Even if collection takes years, the judgment creates a legal obligation that follows her forever. My parents struggled to understand why I was pursuing legal action against family, but Jake helped them see the broader picture. Freddie has been victimized for years while you focused on managing Brenna's crisis, he said gently but firmly. She deserves justice and compensation just like any other victim of financial fraud. The decision to testify in criminal proceedings required extensive preparation with prosecutors across 3 states. Each jurisdiction had built cases focusing on different aspects of Brenna's criminal enterprise, and my testimony provided crucial evidence about her methods of manipulation and family exploitation. Assistant District Attorney James Rodriguez in Philadelphia helped me understand how my testimony would impact the case. Your sister relied on family sympathy to avoid scrutiny of her financial activities, he explained, showing the jury how she exploited that sympathy to fund crimes against strangers demonstrates the calculated nature of her behavior. Preparing for testimony meant reliving years of manipulation and emotional abuse, but it also provided an opportunity to reclaim my narrative from someone who'd twisted my love and generosity into weapons against innocent victims. She used you as an accomplice without your knowledge, Prosecutor Rodriguez continued. Every dollar she stole from you funded crimes against elderly victims who trusted her because of family connections. You're not just a victim seeking justice. You're helping protect future targets from a dangerous predator. The realization that my financial support had indirectly funded crimes against vulnerable elderly victims was devastating, but it also strengthened my resolve to see justice done. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Thompson, and 4 other elderly neighbors had suffered because I'd been manipulated into providing resources for criminal activities. Jake's background in financial investigation proved invaluable in tracking down some of grandmother's stolen jewelry. His contacts at pawn shops and auction houses helped identify several pieces that could potentially be recovered through legal action. 3 items from your grandmother's collection were sold to established dealers, who maintain detailed provenance records. He reported after weeks of investigation. We can potentially recover them, but it will require court orders and significant legal expenses. The engagement ring, a sapphire bracelet from 1897, and grandmother's pearl necklace had been sold for approximately 30% of their appraised value. Recovering them would cost more in legal fees than their monetary worth, but their sentimental value made the expense worthwhile. My parents' response to my legal actions revealed the depth of dysfunction that had enabled Brenna's criminal career. Instead of supporting my efforts to recover stolen property and seek justice, they focused on protecting her from consequences and minimizing the harm she'd caused. "You're destroying what's left of our family," Patricia accused during a confrontational phone call. "Brenna made mistakes, but sending her to prison won't bring back the money or fix the relationships she damaged." "The relationship was never real," I replied firmly. "She was using me as a funding source for criminal activities. I wasn't her sister. I was her mark." The clarity that came with accepting this reality was both painful and liberating. Years of guilt about not doing enough, not loving enough, not supporting enough could finally be released because the person I'd been trying to save had never actually existed. Robert attempted a different manipulation strategy appealing to my professional compassion as a nurse. "You've dedicated your career to helping people heal," he said. "Doesn't Brenna deserve the same compassion you show your patients?" "My patients don't steal from me to fund crimes against elderly people," I responded. "My patients don't manipulate my love to exploit vulnerable community members. My patients don't threaten family safety when their lies are exposed." The support from Jake's family provided a stark contrast to my parents' continued enabling. His mother offered to testify as a character witness about the financial stress I'd endured while supporting Brenna. His father provided business references that helped establish my credibility with prosecutors and civil attorneys. "Real family protects and supports each other," Jake's mother explained gently. "What your parents call loyalty looks more like enabling destruction from our perspective." 6 months of legal proceedings culminated in plea negotiations that would determine Brenna's sentence and restitution obligations. Her defense attorney attempted to negotiate reduced charges in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations into the offshore accounts and additional victims. She's finally facing the choice between accepting responsibility and continuing to manipulate the system, Prosecutor Rodriguez explained. "The evidence is overwhelming, but her response to plea offers will determine whether she receives minimum or maximum sentences." Brenna's decision to reject initial plea offers revealed that even facing overwhelming evidence and certain conviction, she remained focused on avoiding accountability rather than making amends to victims. Her attorney's strategy centered on portraying her as a gambling addict rather than a calculating criminal. "The defense will argue that addiction impaired her judgment and reduced her culpability," Prosecutor Rodriguez warned. "That's why your testimony about the systematic nature of her manipulation is so important. You can show the jury that her behavior was calculated and predatory, not impulsive." Dr. Chen helped me understand that testifying wouldn't just serve justice for past crimes. It would also protect future victims by ensuring Brenna received appropriate sentences and court-ordered supervision upon release. "Individuals with her personality profile don't reform through standard rehabilitation programs," Dr. Chen explained. "The best protection for society is extended incarceration, followed by intensive supervision that limits opportunities for financial crimes." My grandmother's will provided an unexpected development that strengthened both criminal and civil cases against Brenna. Attorney Walsh discovered that the stolen jewelry collection had been specifically bequeathed to me in a trust document that bypassed my parents' inheritance. Your grandmother created a separate trust specifically for her jewelry collection. Attorney Walsh explained, consulting the newly discovered documents. The items were never your parents' property to give Brenna access to. This was outright theft of your inheritance, which carries additional criminal penalties. The trust revelation also uncovered a hidden bank account containing $40,000 that grandmother had designated for my future home purchase. The account had remained undiscovered for 3 years because it was managed by a different bank than the family's primary financial institution. This changes everything, Attorney Walsh said with satisfaction. Your sister stole items worth approximately $15,000 that belonged specifically to you, and there's a separate inheritance that gives you financial independence to pursue justice without worrying about immediate economic consequences. The combination of recovered inheritance, criminal restitution orders, and civil lawsuit damages would provide resources to rebuild my financial stability, while ensuring Brenna faced meaningful consequences for her crimes. More importantly, it demonstrated that standing up for myself led to better outcomes than years of trying to appease someone who viewed my compassion as weakness to exploit. The courthouse steps felt solid beneath my feet as I walked toward the building where Brenna would finally face justice for years of systematic fraud and manipulation. 6 months of investigation, legal preparation, and emotional healing had led to this moment. Jake squeezed my hand as we approached the entrance, his steady presence providing strength for the most important testimony of my life. Inside the courtroom, victims filled 2 rows of benches behind the prosecution table. Mrs. Rodriguez sat with her nephew, still showing confusion about why someone she'd trusted had stolen her grocery money. Mr. Thompson, the 79-year-old veteran whose pension checks Brenna had stolen, clutched his walker with arthritic hands. Seeing the faces of real people harmed by crimes funded with my money reinforced my determination to speak the truth. Brenna sat at the defense table wearing an orange jumpsuit, her usual confident demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. 6 months in jail awaiting trial had stripped away the polished facade she'd maintained while manipulating our family. Her attorney, a public defender overwhelmed by the evidence against his client, shuffled through papers with little apparent hope. Judge Patricia Williams had 25 years of experience with white-collar crime and family financial abuse. Her reputation for thoughtful sentencing that balanced justice with rehabilitation made her an ideal choice for a case involving both systematic fraud and family manipulation. The state will present evidence that the defendant conducted a sophisticated criminal enterprise spanning 4 years and multiple states. Prosecutor Rodriguez announced in his opening statement. She exploited family relationships, religious affiliations, and community trust to systematically steal from victims, including elderly neighbors, family members, and strangers whose identities she stole for financial gain. My testimony began with the simple facts of our relationship and gradually revealed the sophisticated manipulation tactics Brenna had used to extract money while concealing her criminal activities. The bank records Jake had insisted on maintaining provided undeniable proof of systematic exploitation disguised as family support. She called crying about eviction notices that turned out to be fabricated. I testified, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the memories. She claimed to be attending rehab programs that she never enrolled in. She begged for emergency funds to prevent homelessness while secretly living rent-free in apartments I was unknowingly paying for. The defense attorney's cross-examination attempted to portray my record-keeping as vindictive rather than protective, but Jake's financial expertise had anticipated this strategy. Our documentation wasn't punitive. It was the type of careful financial management any responsible adult would maintain when lending substantial amounts of money. Did you ever refuse your sister's requests for financial assistance? The defense attorney asked, hoping to establish that I'd enabled her behavior. I refused several times when the amount seemed excessive or her explanations didn't make sense. I replied truthfully. Each time I expressed concern, she threatened to cut contact with our family and accused me of not caring whether she became homeless or died from addiction. The emotional manipulation tactics were textbook examples of how skilled manipulators exploit family bonds to avoid accountability. Dr. Chen's expert testimony helped the jury understand that addiction doesn't typically involve the sophisticated planning and documentation found in Brenna's criminal activities. True addiction involves impulsive behavior driven by compulsion, Dr. Chen explained to the jury. The defendant's crimes show careful planning, target selection, and systematic execution over multiple years. This pattern indicates antisocial personality traits rather than addiction-driven decision-making. The prosecution's presentation of evidence took 3 days and painted a comprehensive picture of Brenna's criminal enterprise. Bank records, forged documents, victim statements, and expert analysis demonstrated that her crimes were business ventures rather than desperate acts driven by addiction. Mrs. Rodriguez's nephew provided particularly compelling testimony about the impact of elder financial abuse on vulnerable community members. "My aunt trusted Brenna because she came recommended through church connections," he explained. "She used that trust to systematically steal money my aunt needed for medications and basic living expenses." The defense's case lasted less than a day and focused entirely on portraying Brenna as a victim of gambling addiction rather than a calculating predator. Character witnesses described her childhood and adolescent behavior, but none could explain the sophisticated nature of her criminal activities or provide evidence of genuine remorse. Brenna's own testimony proved disastrous for her defense. Instead of showing remorse for her victims, she focused on justifying her actions and minimizing the harm caused by her crimes. Her responses to cross-examination revealed the narcissistic traits that had driven her criminal behavior. "I never intended to hurt anyone," she claimed when asked about elderly victims. "I thought I could win the money back and pay everyone before they noticed. It wasn't supposed to be permanent." "But you continued stealing for 4 years. Prosecutor Rodriguez pressed. "At what point did you plan to stop taking money from elderly neighbors who trusted you?" "I don't know," Brenna admitted. "There was always another emergency or another opportunity. I kept thinking the next big win would solve everything." The admission revealed that she'd never intended to stop stealing. She'd simply hoped to avoid getting caught. Her testimony confirmed the prosecution's argument that she was a career criminal rather than an addict seeking recovery. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Federal charges for identity theft, state charges for elder abuse, and local charges for fraud and theft resulted in a combined sentence of 7 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. The court finds that this was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that caused substantial harm to vulnerable victims. Judge Williams announced during sentencing, "The defendant showed no genuine remorse and continued attempting to manipulate proceedings even after conviction." The restitution order required Brenna to pay over $170,000 to victims, with my share totaling $35,000, including interest and penalties. While collection would take years, the legal judgment provided official recognition that I'd been victimized and deserved compensation. My parents attended the sentencing hearing but sat on the opposite side of the courtroom from victim families. Their continued focus on Brenna's well-being rather than victim justice demonstrated that enabling patterns would require extensive therapy to address. After the hearing, Patricia approached me with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry we didn't protect you from her," she said quietly. "We were so focused on managing crisis that we failed to see how much you were sacrificing to help someone who was lying to all of us." "I forgive you," I replied honestly. "But forgiveness doesn't mean returning to old patterns that enabled destruction. If you want a relationship with Jake and me, it has to be based on mutual respect and healthy boundaries." Robert nodded slowly, his face showing years of aging in months. "We're starting therapy next week to understand how we failed both our daughters. You by not protecting you and Brenna, by not getting her real help when it might have made a difference. The commitment to professional help represented the first genuine step toward accountability I'd seen from my parents. While rebuilding trust would take years, their willingness to examine their enabling patterns offered hope for eventual reconciliation based on healthier dynamics. Jake and I used grandmother's recovered inheritance to purchase our first home, a charming colonial in a neighborhood where elderly residents felt safe walking alone at night. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of us. Building our life with money intended for my future rather than money stolen from vulnerable victims felt like justice completed. The jewelry recovery process took 8 months but successfully returned 5 of 7 stolen pieces, including great-grandmother's engagement ring and the sapphire bracelet from 1897. The emotional value of holding these family heirlooms again far exceeded their monetary worth. My nursing career flourished as I channeled experiences with family financial abuse into advocacy for vulnerable patients. Hospital social work programs benefited from my understanding of how financial exploitation operates and how healthcare workers can recognize warning signs in elderly patients. You've created training programs that help our staff identify and report financial abuse, my supervisor noted during my annual performance review. Your personal experience transformed into professional expertise that protects vulnerable patients throughout our healthcare system. Jake and I began mentoring young couples through our church's marriage preparation program, sharing lessons about setting healthy boundaries with family members who demand financial support for destructive behaviors. Our story provided real-world examples of how protecting yourselves enables you to genuinely help others from positions of strength. 6 months after Brenna's sentencing, I received a letter from federal prison attempting to re-establish contact and seeking financial support for commissary purchases. The familiar manipulation tactics were immediately recognizable expressions of love claims about positive changes and subtle requests for money disguised as maintaining family relationships. I showed the letter to Dr. Sarah Martinez, the therapist I'd been seeing to process trauma from years of emotional manipulation. "How do you feel about her attempt to re-establish contact?" she asked. "Relieved that I can recognize the manipulation immediately," I replied honestly. "A year ago, I would have felt guilty about not responding. Now I understand that protecting myself from further exploitation isn't selfish, but necessary for maintaining the healthy life I've built." The letter went unanswered and no additional correspondence followed. Brenna's lack of persistence suggested she'd moved on to manipulating other family members or prison acquaintances who might prove more susceptible to her tactics. My relationship with my parents improved gradually as they demonstrated genuine changes through consistent therapy attendance and modified behavior patterns. They never again asked me to prioritize Brenna's needs over my own well-being, and they learned to celebrate my achievements without qualification or comparison to their other daughter's situation. "We're proud of the life you've built," Patricia said during our first family dinner in the new house. "You showed more strength and wisdom than we did, and your marriage is everything we hoped you'd find." Robert added his perspective as someone who'd lost a business due to financial crime. "Watching you rebuild after being victimized taught us what real resilience looks like. You turned betrayal into advocacy and used painful experiences to help protect other people. The foundation for renewed family relationships was mutual respect rather than obligation or guilt. My parents earned my trust by demonstrating sustained change rather than demanding forgiveness based on shared blood or family history. Jake and I celebrated our first anniversary with a trip to Ireland, using money saved from my nursing salary rather than wedding gifts stolen by family members. The symbolism of financing our honeymoon through honest work rather than recovered stolen funds felt like completing the transformation from victim to victor. Standing on the cliffs of Moher, watching waves crash against ancient rocks, I reflected on the journey from enabling destruction to building strength. The sister I'd tried to save had never actually existed, but the woman I'd become through surviving her betrayal was stronger, wiser, and more capable of genuine love than I'd imagined possible. "Do you ever regret confronting her at our wedding?" Jake asked as we watched the sunset paint the ocean gold. "Never," I replied without hesitation. The truth was going to come out eventually. Better to face reality when we were strong enough to handle it together than to keep enabling destruction while hoping someone else would change. The lesson that emerged from our ordeal was both simple and profound. Protecting yourself from exploitation isn't selfish, but essential for building the life you deserve. True family relationships are based on mutual respect and support, rather than one-sided sacrifice and manipulation. Genuine love requires boundaries that protect everyone involved from destructive patterns. By refusing to continue funding criminal activities disguised as family loyalty, I'd protected both myself and future victims from someone who viewed compassion as weakness to exploit. Today, Jake and I are expecting our first child, a daughter we plan to raise with strong values about self-worth and healthy relationships. She'll learn that family means protecting and supporting each other, not enabling destruction or sacrificing personal well-being for people who refuse to change. Our story demonstrates that justice isn't always immediate, but it's always possible when you have the courage to stand up for what's right. Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to participate in someone else's destructive choices, even when they share your blood. If you've experienced financial exploitation by family members, what was the turning point that helped you recognize the manipulation and fight back? Share your story in the comments below and help others find the strength to protect themselves from those who would exploit their love. Like this video if it resonated with your experiences, subscribe for more stories about overcoming family betrayal, and share this message with anyone who needs to hear that they deserve respect and honesty from people who claim to love them. Remember that setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's the foundation for building relationships based on genuine care rather than manipulation and control. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you find the courage to choose your own well-being over destructive family patterns. You deserve a life filled with people who support your dreams rather than exploit your generosity.